this is right here? This is some of my hard-shelled nuts from my latest batch of properly prepared hard-shelled nuts. And they've been such a hit with my clients that I wanted to get on here and explain how to make them properly, and also talk a little bit about seeds and grains and legumes. All right, so did you know that most nuts, seeds, grains, and legumes, and for all practical purposes, I'll probably just call them seeds going forward because that's a mouthful. Most seeds are not as nutritious and healthy for us as we think. All right, and that is because seeds are a plant's next generation. And so the plant builds protection mechanisms into these seeds. We call them anti-nutrients to discourage mammals from eating and digesting those seeds. Now we have a whole spectrum of seeds that we could talk about. Today we're specifically talking about hard-shelled nuts. But before you go downing that Costco container of roasted almonds, you might want to think again. So if we look at non-modernized populations, and if we study anthropology and we look at some of these hunter-gatherer populations that are in existence today to look for some ancestral wisdom as far as like how much seeds to consume and what types, then we'd see that most non-modernized populations consume the majority of their daily calories from animal foods, which include animal meats, fats, and organs, and then some plant matter depending on what's available. And that also includes some starchy things like some potatoes and sweet potatoes and roots, tubers, and bulbs. Sometimes they would have fruit if they had access to fruit. And then nuts and seeds and grains and legumes were a very small part of their diet. And they were typically seen as like a secondary resource or a backup plan. All right, so if one of these populations had a really harsh winter, or maybe they went through an extended period of time without having a kill, then they would probably turn more to nuts and seeds and grains and legumes than they would normally, because their primary food source that gave them the most nutritional value and made them feel the best was the things that we just mentioned. Animal foods, which include animal meats, fats, organs, plant matter depending on what's available, that includes starchy things, a little bit of fruit, and then seeds were more like their backup plan or a complement to what they were eating. So the evolutionary template for eating hard-shelled nuts would be that they were a complement to a real food way of eating. If we look at science and to see what science can tell us, and what I mean by science is looking at seeds and looking at these different nutrients and anti-nutrients contained in the seeds, then we'd see that science validates what our ancestors knew intuitively. And that is that these seeds contain problematic factors. All right, so all seeds, just about every seed in existence, have been put under the microscope to see what levels of these different anti-nutrients are contained in them. Now, from our client experience, and we work with a lot of people here locally, we'd also validate that because we see that most people don't do well on seeds in general. If you make them properly, you do a little bit better. But again, the template is a small amount, a complement compared to all the other nutrient-dense foods that we're consuming. So if we take hard-shelled nuts, for example, I remember when I was a kid, my grandpa used to take me fishing and hunting all the time. And so I used to meet him in this place before the sun came up, and we'd sit by the fire, and he had a big bowl of hard-shelled nuts, and we'd sit there and crack them open with a nutcracker or a hammer. And so we'd eat, walnuts and pecans and things like that. And I remember that was such a pain to me as a kid. Like I was really impatient, and I felt like, wow, this is a lot of work for a little bit of food. Now, and it was. So you take that understanding of how difficult it is to get into a hard-shelled nut. And so the evolutionary template for the amount would be about a handful a day. Now, we're not saying don't consume these things, because when you prepare them properly, you actually make them very nutritious, and you get a very broad micronutrient profile that you're not going to get from animal foods and plant matter. And so specifically, like we like some things like hard-shelled nuts, the fancy mixed nuts, including Brazil nuts, because Brazil nuts contain a lot of selenium in a way that's very bioavailable and easy for the system to assimilate. And then, getting this broad spectrum of mixed fancy nuts, you're starting to get a lot of other nutrients that we're probably not getting from other foods. Now, to prepare hard-shelled nuts properly, we want to think about how do we mitigate these anti-nutrients and how do we make these seeds a little bit more digestible. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to soak the hard-shelled nuts. And by the way, these are hard-shelled nuts that have been deshelled, so it's not in the shell, right? So we want to soak these hard-shelled nuts for 24 hours. That soaking process mimics what happens when a seed is in the dirt and it has access to sun and nutrients, and when the water hits the seed, it starts to activate itself, it starts to grow. And in that activation process, it starts to lower its defenses, and it also starts to pull back on its anti-nutrients. All right, so soaking is extremely crucial. To that soaking process, ideally we would add an acidic medium, so that would be something like apple cider vinegar, or my favorite is using a scoop of full-fat yogurt. And so that acidic medium is going to provide an environment that facilitates the growth of beneficial microorganisms and bacteria strains. All right, so if you can imagine, there's a lot of different microorganisms out there. Some of them we don't want in our system, so this acidic environment helps the growth of the things that we know do well in our system. And I like using a spoonful of yogurt because the yogurt actually contains some of those beneficial microorganisms. So that soaking process for 24 hours with some apple cider vinegar, or my favorite, a scoop of yogurt, is not just soaking and activating, it's also fermenting. And that fermentation process helps to break down those anti-nutrients even more. All right, then the third thing that we want to do is after we rinse those soaked and fermented nuts, we want to spread them out on some cookie sheets or put them in a dehydrator and either fully dehydrate or lightly roast them. So the dehydration / roasting process is going to mitigate those anti-nutrients even more, and it's going to make them a little bit more digestible. So that 3-step process, soaking, adding an acidic medium or something that allows them to ferment a little bit, and then roasting, not only mitigates these anti-nutrients to the max, but it also makes these hard-shelled nuts easier to digest. All right, so here's a walkthrough demonstration of how I make my amazing, properly prepared, soaked and fermented, and dehydrated roasted hard-shelled nuts. Now the first thing you want to do is get some raw nuts, and you want to start with raw because if you buy something that's previously roasted, first of all, roasted is almost always going to be in some inappropriate oil like peanut oil. But remember, we want to soak and activate and then ferment, which helps to break things down, and we want to start with raw nuts. Now raw nuts, you know, if you buy them at Whole Foods or Sprouts or Trader Joe's, like they tend to be really expensive, like $14, $15, $16, $17, $18 a pound. And so my favorite place so far, and you may find something a little bit better, different, is nuts.com. So nuts.com, very consistent, very high quality, and I've just been really pleased with them. Like I just like their packaging, I like their letters and their little messages they send. And so as you can see here, a 5-pound bag of raw mixed nuts, which includes cashews, almonds, Brazil nuts, filberts, and pecans. And by the way, we really like the Brazil nuts because they give us a daily amount of our daily allowance of selenium in a very bioavailable form. So I'd always make sure that your mixed nuts contain the Brazil nuts. That comes out to be about $10 a pound. Even if you don't buy the $5 or 5-pound package, that's still around $10 a pound, which is a really, really good price. And then we have I like to add to the mix because these aren't in there and I want to try to get as much variety as I can. And you can add other things too, but I usually get a pound bag of walnuts, and that comes out to be about $9 a pound. And then I also get a pound bag of macadamia nuts, and that comes out to be about $18 a pound. And you can add some others to it. You know, I'm sure at some point in the future I'll try maybe pistachios or something. Can't think of anything else that I'd want in there. But on average, when you factor all that in, I use the 5 pounds of raw mixed nuts and then the pound of walnuts and a pound of macadamia nuts. That's about $11.50 a pound, and that's just still a really, really good price. All right, so get your raw nuts, and then you want to pour them all into a big container. So whether you're doing like a small batch or a huge batch or whatever, pour them into a big mixing bowl and then stir them up and mix them up. And then you'd want to add that to some mason jars with some water, but you want to make sure that you add a spoonful of yogurt, full-fat yogurt, to that mixing process. And when you put them in the jars, they're going to look something like this. It's going to be some big mason jars. Here I have half-gallon mason jars, but I have it filled with water. I leave a little bit of space at the top from the nuts because they tend to expand. So I'd say fill the nuts up and leave yourself a couple of inches at the top, fill it up with water, add this spoonful of yogurt, and then shake it up, and then let them soak for 24 hours. And you can give or take just a little bit. And you should notice that they actually do ferment because the lid starts to poof up a little bit. All right, now after that soaking process, then you want to rinse your nuts and lay them out on some cookie sheets. You're going to notice they're really soft and expanded. Lay them out on some cookie sheets. You may have to do this in several batches depending on how many nuts you started with. And then when you lay them out on the cookie sheets, you want to I mean, for me, you can also use a dehydrator, but what I do is I put it in the oven at a low temperature. So I think the lowest setting in my oven was 170. And I cracked the oven door just a little bit, and I put what we call a snake in there. So I took a piece of tin foil and wrapped it up, and so the door was open just a little bit to facilitate some air moving through there. But you don't have to do that. But anyway, so you want a low roast temp at the lowest setting, 150, 170 degrees, and do that as long as it takes for the nuts to get crispy. And so what you'll have to do is at about the 24-hour mark, or a day later, or a day and a half later, you're going to have to like just test one and see if it's crispy or not. All right, so after they become crispy, then what I do is I'll take them out and I'll put them back in that big mixing bowl, and I'll add some melted ghee, and then I'll also add, and I'll stir that up so that they're all coated with a little bit of ghee, and then I'll add a little bit of salt, and I'll drizzle with a little bit of honey, and I'll mix all that up. And I'm not trying to make my nuts taste really sweet, but you'll mix all that up, and then you'll spread it back on the cookie sheets, and then put it back in the oven for a few more hours or something along those lines. And if you do that, by the time you get done, your nuts are going to come out, you know, very gently roasted, but they're fully dehydrated. They're nice and crispy. They have a little bit of salt to them, a tad bit of sweet to them. You can do some other things like maybe add in some almond extract or vanilla extract or something, but I think the way that I just lined it out is just perfect. And let me know how it goes. Let me know if you have any feedback or any comments or you know, other little tips or strategies. Be careful, because they are amazing and people will just want to walk away with them. All right, thank y'all for tuning in.